Okay, thank you. I was going to complain about being placed in the mapping section because Orbis is not a map, and then I realized that I called it Redrawing the Map. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about something that you've probably come across before. It's a model built at Stanford over a period of 8 months in 2012, funded, I should say, by a digital humanities grant at Stanford, done by me and Elijah Meeks and a bunch of grad students mostly. So I'm going to keep this short. The original inspiration was that I've always been dissatisfied with conventional maps that show something like the Roman Empire from outer space, which doesn't tell you very much at all about how it's interconnected, how it works as a system, when it really looked like this. And I'll take 10 minutes from A to B explaining why it really looks like this. Now, the original inspiration was, of course, the London subway map. This is the iconic image that focuses, again, doesn't really do justice to geography, it focuses on interconnectivity, right? It tells you how we get from one line to another. This is what the system really looks like in actual space. But the one thing it doesn't tell you, of course, is how long it takes to get from A to B. Now, if you use the London subway, you never know how long it takes. There's a way to break down halfway through, but apart from that, at least ideally, you should be able to do this. And that's a very neat map where you can go to any given point, and the map reconfigures itself to show you how long it would take, in theory at least, to get from Heathrow, let's say, to any other point in the network, and each concentric circle stands for a certain amount of time. And I always wanted to do something like this for the entire Roman Empire, which is obviously a little more difficult, and that's why we built the model. In order to do this, we needed to have nodes, sites. Of course, there are zillions. Tom will tell you the precise number, zillions of sites. I guess at this point, as we know, we use about 750, all the major cities and a few landmarks that you need for travel, navigation, and so on. Those are the nodes that we have ranked according to size, following the Barrington Atlas. And then we had to connect those nodes by land, river, and sea. Of course, the Romans conveniently built hundreds of thousands of miles of roads, so we picked about 50,000 miles of them, about 800 road segments, which is the minimum you need to set up a reasonably functional network, again using standard map resources. That's the resultant network, which is enough to cover the entire space and interconnect it. Then we had to figure out the cost of travel in terms of time, in terms of price, in terms of time. There are many, many different ways of using a road, so we had to, well, I had to process a huge amount of ancient and comparative evidence to figure out some kind of reasonably realistic standardized rates for, different types of travel, from the ox to the horse relay. Then, of course, you have to adjust this, ideally, because the roads are not all the same. And, of course, if you go uphill, it takes longer than if you go on a plane or downhill. There are seasonal constraints. If you have a mountain pass in the Alps, it's frozen over in the winter, it takes longer, or it can't be traversed. This just illustrates differences in grade, right? If you go up from the plain into the mountains, you incur additional costs. So we entered a series of rather rough adjustments, mostly in the most mountainous regions, Alps, Taurus, and so on, either adjusting for grade and or adjusting for seasonal constraints, like passes not being usable in the winter, and that kind of thing. But of course, this could be done in a much more sophisticated way, and we hope to do so in the future. Then we needed to have information on price, which comes from Diocletian's price edict. That's this one document from 301 AD that has the advantage of producing rates for land, river, and sea travel at the same time. So we can at least use the ratios derived from this kind of document. And comparative evidence suggests it's actually not that unrealistic. They had some idea of what they were doing at the time. River transport is, of course, tricky. We focus on about 24 major rivers that are usable more or less year-round. Most of the rivers that come out of the Alps, the River Nile, and a few others. Rivers are very problematic in the Mediterranean because they tend to dry up seasonal in the summer. They run low, you can't use them. any number of problems which I really can't go into. Rivers have changed because of regulation the last couple of centuries. They're shorter, they're faster, they're slower in the case of the Nile. All kinds of things have changed in the meantime. So again, we had to draw on a wide range of evidence, contemporary and historical. We tried to take a kind of seasonal variation, which was possible for those rivers that were reasonably well attested. So almost each river has its own speed variance. Then we have price cost, again drawn from Diocletian's price edict, which very usefully tells us rates from upriver and downriver travel, which is the main difference. So again, we could enter standardized costs. That gives us the model where you have the nodes connected by roads and the rivers in blue. Also, the one thing that's missing now is sea travel, without which you can't really have any kind of meaningful connectivity in this period. So we had to look at what the major routes were, drawing on work by Pascal Arnaud, of putting in all the major routes that are known from geographical sources, from Hellenistic Roman periods, archaeology, and so on, for the Mediterranean, Black Sea, and the coastal Atlantic. Even though for the coastal Atlantic there's really no evidence. This produces a network of about 900 sea routes. There are only 450 routes, but they're counted separately because the speed varies by direction, obviously. Many of them are coastal routes, or routes between islands, which is what people did most of the time. And then we have all the main intercontinental, interregional routes that create long-term connectivity. You can see this here schematically. I think it's just a selection with the covering the entire sea space all the way up to Britain, with the blue ones being the interregional ones, and the green ones are the ones that go across the coast between Aegean islands and that kind of thing. Now, we did this by, my IT guys did this by creating a polyline mesh that covers the entire seascape, almost 5 million square kilometers, so that can be visualized like this. This is the coast of Israel. And what a notional Roman-style sailing vessel does, it seeks, or the algorithm seeks, the least cost path with the vessel traveling around the edges of these very many squares that fill out this particular seascape. Now, in order to do that, we had to simulate the movement of a Roman-style sailing ship in response to winds and currents, which, as far as I know, had never been done before. Luckily, there was a grad student called Arsenis who sails a lot, and he built an algorithm from first principles, because it was not available, which worked surprisingly well. So you take Roman rigging techniques, and then you figure out how a ship would move if the wind comes from there, it's this strong, and so on. Don't ask me, but all I can say, it does work, remarkably enough. The base data come from standard nautical resources, the kind of pilot charts you would use if you went sailing in the Mediterranean today. It's mostly a wind-based model because currents are not very strong in the Mediterranean, luckily, except in some straits like Bosporus and so on, where we did actually need this information. This is what these charts look like. We have wind roses and so on that provide a wealth of data for each month of the year. So we have a monthly resolution for 2 different types of ship, depending on their rigging or their navigational capabilities. And as I said, in some cases, currents are factored in as well. Then we simulated sailing times for a number of routes which happened to be attested in ancient sources, and then compared the projected outcomes with the attested outcomes. And on average, they are exactly the same. There's no difference ultimately between our projections and what the ancient sources tell us, which shows that the algorithm is surprisingly robust. We didn't actually have to modify it work from day 1, which came as a great surprise to me. So all the projected outcomes are within a relatively narrow range from the documented sailing times. We also have prices, again from Diocletian's price edict, where Orbis could show for the first time that the attested charges, the freight charges in this document from any one port to another port, are very sensitive to sailing time. So clearly people had an idea of how long it would take normally under good conditions to sail from A to B and set prices accordingly. So we could actually indicate that document as well. So that produces the final model where you have all these various components. It covers about 10 million square kilometers, half of it is land, half of it is sea. As you see here, about 200,000 miles worth of routes, mostly on water. Now, then we have to calculate discrete cost outcomes for all these various ways of transportation, for different vehicles, different times of the year, blah, 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 blah. That gives you about 360,000 plus discrete cost outcomes, which are pre-calculated, live somewhere on the server, and are reconfigured depending on what you're looking for, which you do by using the Orders website, which I'm sure you've seen before, which has about 50 pages worth of write-up explaining everything that we try to do. This is the key piece. The map where you enter your various search requests and you get, results. I'm not going to take you through this because you can do it yourself online, and that's not really what I wanted. This is the strange thing. I knew what I wanted, which is what I showed you earlier, right? The London subway network. This is not it. This is a necessary step on the way to that, but it's not actually what I wanted, so I want to focus on that. Because in different ways, I'm interested not to how to get from A to B, I'm interested in how the system as a whole is configured and works. And you can do this, you can visualize it in different ways. This is the travel time from any of the 750 sites to the city of Rome in the summer using certain means of transportation. And each of these zones stands for, I think, 1 week of travel time. So the greener the area is, the less time it takes to get to the city of Rome, and the red ones are really far away, which is not very surprising. You can do this in as colored dots as well. Again, you can see at a glance how the empire is really configured in terms of travel time. You can do it for Constantinople, where everything shifts. Now, so the center is in the east, in the Aegean, and Western Europe, unsurprisingly, is really far away. You can do this also for price cost, for blurry, but you can see at a glance, if you just look at the green dots, the entire Mediterranean basin is susceptible to economic integration because very cheap to move goods between the center and almost any point in the Mediterranean. But if you go to an area that looks close on the map, like the Danube Basin, it's really far away because it costs a lot to connect the Mediterranean to the upper Danube or the interior of Spain or the interior of Anatolia and so on. You can do this in different ways. You can use cost contours, you can cover it. Again, this is just different ways of visualizing the same kind of information. And this is what I ultimately wanted to do. This is known as a distance cardiogram, which reconfigures, which expresses cost as physical distance. So Rome is always in the middle here, and any inch on this map stands for a certain cost unit, in this case, time. So the farther something is away from the center, the longer it took to get there, or to get from there to the center. It's a little difficult to label this because everything tends to be clumped together in the center. But you can see this distorts a regular map quite a bit. That's the case even more with price costs, because there are huge differences in price costs between maritime travel, which is very cheap, and land travel, which is very expensive. And this is essentially what you get if you do this for the entire Roman Empire. To make this a little clearer, the Mediterranean is here in the center. Everything else is the continental hinterland. And you can see certain parts are really far away. Logistically, central Spain, so the Madrid area, which was pretty isolated even in the 16th century, when it became the capital of Spain. Central Gaul, the upper Danube Basin, Romania, the interior of Asia Minor, the Egyptian oasis, unsurprisingly, it's really hard to get to, and so on. Now, again, there are different ways of visualizing this. You can take out extraneous information that shows you how the Mediterranean basin is very, very compact, very close together. So it's very, very cheap to move goods and people within that space. And then you have the major river valleys that provide connections to this Mediterranean core, the Rhone-Rhine axis, Danube, Nile, and so on. But you can see that even upper Danube basin is not very well connected. You can play around with this. You can try to establish what the core of the Roman Empire was. This is combines ecological conditions, where you have Mediterranean kind of flora, olive oil cultivation in this case, and map onto this the areas that were the easiest, the fastest, the cheapest to reach or connect to from Rome itself. And they're largely coextensive. There's essentially a core coastal area that the Romans had really come to control by about 100 BC. I don't have time to go into this, but we can show that Roman expansion, broadly speaking, follows these logistical constraints. It unfolds in keeping with cost constraints. So the Romans follow sort of the path of least resistance, oddly enough, in terms of cost. And the most expensive to reach areas are the ones that are reached the latest and are the first to be abandoned. So history, very broadly speaking, unfolds in keeping with these cost constraints. And I'm currently in the process of writing this up. That's another way of visualizing something. This is the deployment of the Roman army in, I don't know, 200 AD or something like that, in terms of how long it took for these legions to reach the city of Rome, and they wanted to. And you can see that the eastern armies are considerably farther away. You really have a de facto split of the empire into two halves, which foreshadows the kind of partition that you get from the 5th century onwards, which is already there earlier in terms of military deployments. And so eventual outcomes are really an almost inevitable effect of these kinds of configurations. Anyway, so the model is deliberately crude, it's deliberately top-down. In that sense, it's very different from what people usually try to do, because they start from the bottom, they have one island or one valley, we go to the next valley and that kind of thing. We start from the top, because we're interested in the properties of the system overall, and it accounts for certain, the crudeness and simplifying assumptions built into this, because there's no other way of doing it. And these are things that we are thinking of doing. There are various ways of improving or extending the model. Intensification means we can put in more information, we can put in all the however many thousands of sites and roads and everything, which wouldn't really change the overall pattern that I showed you. It would make the model more useful for regional study, but not for what I just showed you. We could extend it spatially, we could simulate the Indian Ocean trade, which was governed by the monsoon, winds to India and Sri Lanka, we can do the Silk Road, maybe, not very keen on this. Or we can do probabilistic modeling to make the whole model less rigid, more lifelike, by adding certain variables that will feed into the decision-making process, the pathfinding process, because different types of people would have different preferences, right? If you're a merchant, you want to take a certain route for certain reasons. If you're a pilgrim, you want to take a different route, and so on. And that can be modeled probabilistically, even the odds of actually getting from A to B if you choose to travel in the winter, that kind of thing. You can say, if you take this path, you have a 7% chance, this ship will sink. So that would require sort of the input of additional layers of information, but in a quite consistent way. So we haven't done this yet, but we are in the process of exploring ways of enhancing the model. That's pretty much all that I wanted to say. Thank you very much.